You're listening to the Just Japan podcast. Everything you want to know about Japan.
Well, hey there, folks, and welcome to another episode of the Just Japan podcast. Everything you want to know about Japan. Hisa Shibari. It has been a very long time. The last time you heard me was when I was chatting with Dave Olson, a.k.a. Uncle Weed, online in Okayama. This time we're back with another fantastic interview. First-time guest, I've got John from the Ohazassu podcast. He's based in Nagoya. He's from Australia, and he's got a podcast all about Japan that shares very practical, everyday knowledge about life in Japan, has Japanese word of the day lessons, good stuff, fantastic. We had a great conversation. I know you guys are going to enjoy it. And also some information about a new podcasting project that I've kicked off, Tales from Kevin, the Tales from Kevin podcast, which is something that is out there and alive right now. More to come on that later. But you know what? Let's just sit back and relax and listen to my fantastic conversation with John from the Ohazassu podcast. Yeah, so I'll just get to it because then you're an hour ahead of me.
Yeah, go for it.
I'm hoping all will be well. I've been sick recently. My whole family's been sick, so I'm.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Just, the start of the school year, international school year, the school year just began. And, kids from all over the world are back together. And we all got sick, There's like lots of COVID going around, the influenza, lots of different fun things.
Yeah.
So it's a real mixed bag of garbage.
Oh, boy.
So hopefully I won't break into a coughing fit partway through.
If you do, totally understandable.
Yeah, hopefully not. Well,
go for it.
So let me ask one more, or let me say this one time, because although I've heard you say it many times, it's the Ohazassu podcast. Ohazassu.
Yeah, Ohazassu.
Ohazassu. I don't know why my brain just doesn't. Ohazassu. Oh my God. Okay. Well,
yeah,
that could be that could be part of the charm.
Yeah. It's like Ohazassu is just. Do you know what it is? Ohazassu.
No, I don't even. I know you've mentioned it before, but I'm forgetting now.
This is a great opportunity. Then I can introduce what it actually means. It's a contracted version of Ohayo gozaimasu, and which means good morning in Japanese. So when people greet each other, like colleagues at work and stuff, like when they say it really quick, it's kind of like slang. They say Ohazassu or Hazas.
Okay, but now I wonder, is that a Nagoya thing?
Not that I know of. I mean, it is used in Nagoya, but I'm pretty sure it's just a universal like a contraction of. Because
I can remember like having like often like Japanese men would say to me, they go us.
Yeah, it's kind of like that. Yeah,
us. They up and they nod their head us.
Yeah, it's a bit like that.
I remember when I first came to Japan, I'd say to my wife, "What is that? What does us mean?" Oh, they're saying like Ohio gozaimasu. I'm like, "Oh, really?"
Yeah, and eventually they just say "s," like you just hear this sound.
It's like a snake. Well, you know what? Hey, this is a great way to start things off. Folks listening, thank you. And here we are with the Just Japan podcast, and I'm chatting this evening with John of the Ohazassu. See?
That's it.
The podcast.
Of the Ohazassu podcast. Yeah. It's great to be here, Kevin. Yeah.
That's awesome. Thank you so much for taking the time. And that's really wonderful.
Likewise. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, we have another podcaster on the podcast. It's been a while. I think the last other podcaster I would have had on would have been Tony Vega from Japan Station. And so wondering if you could tell the listeners a little bit about yourself and where you're from and what you do.
Wow, there's a lot to cover, but I'll do my best to keep it short and sweet. I'm from Sydney, Australia, and I actually heard you mention the word Sydney in your previous podcast, and I was like, "Is Kevin from Sydney?" And then I heard you say Nova Scotia.
Yeah, the far less famous one.
Yeah, but I think it's the same spelling, right? Mm-hmm. Maybe.
No, it is. It is.
So I'm from the Australian Sydney in Australia. Mm-hmm. And I mentioned briefly in the previous the meetup that we had on X, on Spaces, that the first time I came to Japan was actually in 1998. And I was fresh out of high school. I finished high school in 1997.
Okay.
And I had been studying Japanese for a lot of high school, for about 4 years
Oh,
or
wow.
5 years in high school.
Hmm.
And so it was by far, it was my favorite subject. And
Yep.
I absolutely loved studying Japanese. And yeah, just, I mean, a lot of things, a lot of friendships and opportunities sort of led to me going to Osaka in 1998.
Mm.
And so I did a working holiday in Osaka for about just under a year back
Okay.
in 98.
Wow.
And so that's how I got into Japanese basically, and how I ended up coming to Japan. It was pretty organic because I started studying Japanese not because I liked it or because I wanted to, but because we had to study it for a year back in year seven. So it
Oh,
was like a compulsory subject at that school at the time.
okay.
And so I got into it by coincidence and I really enjoyed it and I just kept going with it. And and then I ended up in Japan and I went back to Australia for about, I think it was about 10 or 12 years. And I came back 12 years ago.
Okay. Oh, wow.
And so, so I've been, my Japan anniversary is actually coming up in about a week or so, or in just under a week. It's going to be 12 years exactly.
Wow.
Yeah,
Fantastic. That's really cool. So it's really
and
interesting to hear when I talk to Australians. I know that Japan, especially during the bubble era, was such a massive trading partner, such a
exactly.
pivotal trading partner with Australia that Australians learned Japanese in school, just the way as I, as a
Yes.
Canadian, would have learned French in school.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that my wife, who is from Osaka, actually, she lived in Australia for a few years in the early 2000s in Perth,
Wow.
where she worked teaching Japanese at an all-girls school, a
Oh,
private
wow.
school. So
Wow.
the demand was there, right?
Yes, absolutely.
And
Yes.
I wonder, is it now in 2024? Is Japanese actually a subject that would be common in Australian schools anymore?
To my knowledge, no. And I actually, believe it or not, I actually felt the demand dwindle while I was in high school.
Oh, okay, okay.
And what happened is that when I started, it was, when was that? 1992 or 93.
Hmm.
And by the time I reached year 11, where you study it for your final, high school exams and stuff, where you need to study it quite seriously,
Hmm.
there was no one left in my school who wanted to study it. It was just me.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And that was like 96 and 97. And I was devastated. I was like, does this mean I have to stop studying Japanese? And I spoke to a career advisor at our school, and also another a Japanese teacher also helped me out. And fortunately, I was very, very lucky. The Board of Education at the time, I don't know if they still do this, but at the
Hmm.
time they had a Saturday school system that was tied in with the public education system. So if there was a language that you wanted to study that wasn't available at your school,
Okay.
if they had enough places at the Saturday school, you could go there, and it could
Okay.
be completely tied in into your high school, into your scores
Okay.
for your university entrance and all that sort of stuff. So I ended up doing Japanese as a Saturday school subject for year 11 and year 12.
Okay. Okay.
Mm,
Uh,
yeah.
that's really interesting. That's well, a lot of interesting things. I'm going to get into the talking about your podcast in a little bit. I was
Yeah.
actually just sharing a little bit while I was out this afternoon after work. I was walking along and I've got a couple of my good friends who are still in Japan. We have a little WhatsApp chat group, the three of us, and we just throughout the day send each other
Yeah.
messages and chit chat. And I said I was going to be talking to you today, and I said,
Oh, cool. Thank you.
I said I'm going to be interviewing this guy who's got a podcast that I wish was around when I had first gone to Japan, because that's the kind of podcast I really. I guess I'll get into that shortly.
Yeah.
Because I love the kind of very practical information that you give.
I'm happy that comes across because that's one of my goals. I want it to be practical.
Yeah, yeah. It's not that it's I mean, there's a lot of different kind of Japan podcasts, and ones that are, travel, glitz, and this and that. Those have their place and they're needed, and people want those. But what I like is, I mean, in your most recent episode, you were just, talking about different types of Wi-Fi that you can get in your house.
Yes.
And I was like, oh, that's really interesting. I was thinking about my Wi-Fi when I lived in Kobe and how crappy it was. And it was NTT actually. And I often used to struggle when I would do interviews like this because I would, it would just constantly drop. And I would always be like, my Skype would be hanging up on people. But maybe you've, it's several years later, and you're in Nagoya, so maybe there's better internet in Nagoya than Kobe.
I don't think so.
So since you're in Nagoya, I'm curious about Nagoya. Yes. There's not a lot of, obviously when the content is created about YouTube or on YouTube, for example, about Japan, and I think most visitors to Japan, most people who are interested in maybe in the future living in Japan probably consume most of their content from Japan. They're seeing a lot of stuff about Osaka, Kyoto, of course,
correct, yes.
Tokyo. But Nagoya is not a place you hear pop up that often.
That's true, yes.
What's it like living in Nagoya? I've heard lots of jokes.
Yeah, look, Nagoya gets a lot of hate,
a lot of flack.
Yeah, it does. And to be honest, I have my phases with Nagoya, and it's a love and hate relationship sometimes. But overall, look, it's a very what's the best way to describe it? Maybe it's just like a normal place. If I were to say it in a very easy to understand way, it's just a normal place. Yeah. Whereas like Tokyo is Tokyo. It's the biggest city, or one of the biggest cities in the world. It's the biggest city in Japan. Every single corner you turn around, it's wow, wow, wow. Mm-hmm. Osaka has its charm as well. It makes you wow in different ways. Yeah. Nagoya is just a normal place. Like, it's like living in a normal city somewhere back home in Sydney. The population density it's a little bit higher than, like, if you go to the main Nagoya station, it's a lot bigger than the train stations in Sydney City. Mm-hmm. But when you go just a couple of kilometers out of that little CBD at Nagoya station, it's very, very similar to Australia, to Sydney.
Okay. I find that with some of the cities that kind of, what do you call them? The more provincial cities, I suppose. Like when I went to, if you go to like Shimane Prefecture, Matsui City, I can remember going there and I felt like I was kind of back in Canada in a kind of smaller city. The buildings are, the tallest buildings are only 5 or 6 stories, and the way the roads are laid out, I was just like, and I remember like being there one time, I went for a friend's wedding years ago, and I just went on my own, and my wife was back home in Kobe with the kids, and like, messaging her saying like, I feel like I'm walking down the road in Canada right now.
Yes.
So
I think that's sort of where the disappointment comes in, is because when people come to Japan, there's the expectation that everywhere is going to be a bit like Tokyo or Osaka, and when it's not, the brain sort of doesn't know what to do. It's like, this isn't Japan. Like, what is this place? It's
this is not like the manga.
Yeah, exactly. This is not it. What happened? But it has its own culture, I think, and it's, by all means, it's a very big city as well. Like, it's got everything. As you probably know, it's very centrally located. And when I first came here and I didn't like Nagoya so much, I used to actually joke around with my friends quite a bit that I love Nagoya for one thing especially, and that's that it's easy to get out of. Because you can literally take a train, like, 1 hour train ride will get you to any prefecture. You can go to Kyoto in 40 minutes on a bullet train. So it's a fantastic location, convenience-wise. But yeah, look, you when you live here, you get used to it, and you learn all the little secrets to the city. And I actually posted a reply to someone on Twitter the other day. They were talking about how people like where they live or don't like where they live. And when I had thought about that a while back, when I was thinking about my living in Nagoya and how my feelings towards Nagoya had changed, I had this realization that I think if you don't like a place, maybe you just don't know it well enough. And I think the opposite is also true. If you love a place, again, maybe you don't know it well enough because sometimes the longer you live somewhere, you start to see the flaws and the problems. And I think
Mm,
I see this in a lot of conversations on Twitter or X, as it's called now,
yeah.
where people will have this like they have this honeymoon phase when they go somewhere, and then
Yeah.
once reality kicks in, you realize that everywhere, like places, are not fundamentally they're not that different. You know, there are good things and there are bad things, and the same can be said for people as well. When you go to a country and you experience interactions with locals, you'll find that there are fantastic people everywhere, and there are not so fantastic people everywhere.
Oh yeah,
So I think it's
absolutely.
a bit like that. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's, I mean, everywhere
Mm.
you go, you're going to meet, people who are nice and wonderful and welcoming, and people who aren't. Um,
Yeah. Yeah. Mm.
yeah. So, I mean, it's interesting. That you say that. It kind of reminds me of like back in the day. So I've been living abroad now for 22 years. I've lived in,
Wow.
and I first moved from Canada to South Korea in
Hmm.
2002. And at that point, I didn't have global experience. I was a young
Mm.
young Canadian in my mid 20s, and I was just like, Canada's the best, man. We're the best country in the world. Like everything is great about Canada. Everyone loves Canada. Just it doesn't get better than Canada. And
Yep.
I remember, moving abroad. I lived in South Korea for 5 years, and then
Hmm.
I moved back to Canada. And
Yeah.
and during that time, I traveled to China, I traveled to Japan, I traveled to Vietnam and different
Wow.
countries. And when I got back to Canada, and I went back to university actually, for a year to get my teaching certification, and I
Yeah.
realized, hey, Canada, although I am proud to be a Canadian, and I think it's a great place in many ways, it doesn't seem to be as perfect as I thought it was or what I remember. And then you start to see,
Mm.
like I said, I
Mm.
started to see those flaws. I'm like, well, we always talked about how we have free Medicare, but it's really hard to see a doctor now. Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
and
There's all these small things.
and then it's
Yes.
this happens, and then this happens, and wait a
Mm.
second. And then I started saying, well, but when I was in Korea, they could do this better, or in Japan when I visited, this
Yeah.
happened
Yeah.
more efficiently.
Mm.
And all of a sudden, now
Mm.
that I had a different lens, and I could actually compare and contrast critically,
Yes.
I
That's
realized,
very
yeah,
interesting. Yeah.
it is, yeah, yeah. It's that kind of neat experience we have
Mm.
when we live abroad. Um, yeah, yeah. So, you've got this fantastic podcast,
Thank
and
you.
you just published episode number 69, I believe.
Yes.
So
And
you've been
yeah.
doing it for a while. Tell
Hmm.
us about oh gosh, let me try it. I'll try Ohazassu.
Yeah,
No.
that's it. You got it.
Okay, okay,
Ohazassu. Yeah.
podcast. I don't
Yeah.
know why I have so much trouble. I don't know. I don't know what it is. Too much time studying Keigo, I think. Um, so tell me about the origin of this podcast. Like why did you decide to get into podcasting? What was kind
Mm.
of the whole model behind it? What was your thinking when you created the podcast?
Well, let's see. Going back a few years, there was something called Periscope on Twitter. I'm not sure if you know
Oh
of
yeah, yeah, yeah. I
Periscope.
remember. Actually, I
Yeah.
had a few episodes ago, not more than a few episodes ago, but I had Dave in Osaka. That's his handle on Twitter,
Oh yeah, of course. He's
and
he's a veteran.
yeah,
Yeah.
he's an amazing streamer. I mean, he stream
Yes.
and he told the story of how he streamed from North Korea on Periscope
Yeah,
in that
he's
episode.
streamed a lot of stuff. Yeah.
And I remember, like, I had Periscope briefly when I was living in Kobe. I used it a little bit when it was at first out, but I remember Dave was epic as a
Yes.
periscoper. I don't know what to say, but yeah,
I
yeah.
saw him. I saw him streaming. Was about a few days ago in Osaka. I don't know if you managed to catch him, but if you can have a look at his timeline, he did a fantastic stream from. There's a new development in Osaka,
Ah,
really nice green space.
yeah, he
But
does some good
but
stuff.
yeah, but I digress. So going back to the origins of my podcasting and Periscope. So Periscope is how I ended up on Twitter
Okay,
many years ago, and I was actually very ill at the time,
okay.
and I had plenty of time on my hands. I was like I was home and in hospitals getting better for about, I think it was about 6 to 8 months. And during that time, I made connections with people on Twitter, and I started periscoping, and I made some very nice friends during that time. Dave's one of them. And there's a whole bunch of people on Twitter who I still keep in touch with from back then. And I guess that was the first time I sort of started sharing stuff on Japan. It was through those live streams, and it felt really good. It felt rewarding to answer questions about Japan. People would sort of hop onto the stream and ask questions or ask my opinion about something. I would sometimes find something really interesting, and I just wanted to share it, and people really appreciated that. And I've also got, as I mentioned, I started studying Japanese back in high school. So I also really have this passion for the language, and I really, really enjoy helping people out with their Japanese language journey.
Okay.
So I sort of sat down one day and I was like, what can I do with all of this stuff? I want to do something productive, not just sort of randomly tweet about it. And I'd like to make it a bit more structured and something that I can do. And perhaps it's something I can do not full time, but maybe on a more regular basis. And I enjoy, like, my background in Australia is doing sort of DTP work and printing and using the Adobe products and things like that. So I know how to make basic things, on these programs. And yeah, I just enjoy doing all of that stuff, like creating content as well on top of all of that. So I sort of sat down and I said, what do I want to put out? And it's on my bio on my Twitter for Ohazassu podcast. And it's basically just doing, I try to stick to the main themes, and it's lifestyle, news, travel, food, and language. So I'll constantly sort of look for information on these things, and I'll also incorporate lessons and stories from my own life. And I like doing that for a few reasons. Basically, I think through our own stories, we can really effectively teach people through our experience so that they don't have to go through what we went through.
Oh, yeah.
That's one thing. Yeah, that's one thing. And it's also another thing is that we can give advice. This is how I did it and it worked. Maybe you can try it that way as well. And that might work for you as well. So that's kind of, I guess, how it started. And I just jumped in. I just started, and here I am. I honestly can't believe. I know it's not a lot of followers, but to me it is. I've already got 606 followers, and to be honest, I couldn't see myself having that many followers. It's only been a year, I think.
Okay.
So yeah, that's where I'm at.
That's fantastic. I mean, I think something that you had mentioned earlier on in the recording not that long ago is you said the other day, you had shared something on this Japan content creators, kind of Twitter chat that we had, and it's interesting. That's something that was newly created. I had a conversation with Ricky Okanda, Paprika Girl. Last week we Zoomed each other and we were just chatting about podcasting. She just wanted to talk about podcasting and maybe starting one, and I was kind of giving her some ideas, and she said we should put together like a community and like reach out to those who are out there creating content and create a little community. And I know Kurt Bell, Softy Papa, has talked about how that's reminiscent of the old days of YouTube. And back when I was an old school Japan content creator on YouTube, it was very much that way. We worked together, our community, especially pre-monetization.
That's awesome.
Pre-monetization.
Yes.
You were in it. The people were in it for creativity. People were in it for fun. Because no one ever considered like, oh, I can make money at this, or I could make a living, or I could be rich and famous. That was not on our minds, right? So, we would lift each other up. We would shout each other out all the time. We would do collabs, and these were days before there was like Zoom or anything like that. So literally, like, I would film something like a clip and I would send it to you, and you would like edit into your video. Nice. And we would just like, groups of us, like Kansei YouTube
Yes.
creators, we'd just meet up like once a month. We'd meet up at bars. We'd meet up at
That's
Osaka Joe
awesome.
Cohen and just like hang out and drink beer and then we'd have
That's
meetups,
fantastic.
and it was a really
Mm.
fantastic thing. And I think that's kind of what may hopefully it may happen with content creators in Japan as we were chatting
Yes.
different podcasters. But
Yes.
all the different podcasters have different themes, different vibes, different styles, different ways of doing things. And again, like I was saying earlier, I really like that kind of, how shall I say, practical advice that you give. And I like that kind of everyday, non-glitzy, glammy, way of doing things. Like, so for example, like I love the Abroad in Japan podcast, Chris Broad, the famed
Yes.
YouTuber. But he's entertaining, he's funny, he's insightful, but he lives in a very different Japan than I ever would, because especially with his
I
success.
think so. Yes.
With his
Yeah.
success, he's hanging out with like PewDiePie and all these like famous YouTubers and touring around with them. And that's cool and all, but it's cool to hear from people who live lives like the life I lived in Japan or the life I live now.
Yes,
So,
I totally understand. Yeah, it's a completely different genre, a different audience, and there's a practicality, I think, to what we do. We give useful advice, useful stories, and we find different things appeal to us, I think. And I think there's a big trend, I think, now. Like you mentioned before, there was only limited kind of exposure to this kind of thing online, and now you can actually find a lot of information about Japan before coming here.
Oh yeah.
And I think the stuff that we pump out, I think it really, I'd like to think that it helps people who have never been to Japan, and they are perhaps curious about how it would be to live here. And if they're searching for information, I think our content can actually, be of some kind of a reference to them as well.
Yeah, that's a fantastic thing, because back in 1998, I suppose, when you first came to
there was nothing.
Yeah, right. And I came to Asia in 2002, and the only thing I could get was a Lonely Planet guide. Like a Lonely Planet
a
Korea.
lot has changed. Yeah,
So much has changed, right? Yeah. So you have recently, just very recently, started producing a video version of your podcast.
I just recorded another version today.
Oh,
which
fantastic!
I'll try to put up tomorrow. Yeah.
So, what was the impetus behind that? Because that all of a sudden you've just now, you've brought up your workload exponentially to put together a video version, to package that up nicely on YouTube. Why did you decide to take that step?
A couple of things. One of the biggest things is that I can actually show people things visually, whereas on a podcast, I'm very limited in that regard. I can talk about things, but I can't really show things to people. And when I say things, like, for example, I won't spoil it because I haven't uploaded it yet, but I spoke about stationary items in Japan in today's episode.
Okay.
And there's an item that I really, really like, it's actually from America, but I found it in Japan, and I still use them, and I wanted to show people what it is. And so I'm able to do that on a YouTube video, for example. Up till now, I'd been using X, and I would just like take a photo or a small video of something and put it up and say, this is what I was talking about in episode 35, for example. And that kind of takes time, and then it's hard to find later on and all that kind of stuff. And another reason is that I thought I could reach a larger audience or a different audience, because I know not everyone is sort of listening to podcasts. And so I think there are people who do podcasts, people who like looking at YouTubes. Some people just like being on Instagram, so I thought, why not? And you mentioned the workload, and it is quite a bit of work to get a video going. And that's something I've been thinking about, how do I do this in a way that's streamlined and doesn't add too much workload to what I'm doing. And yeah, that took a while actually. And that's one of the reasons why it's taken me so long to start uploading to YouTube. So I kind of have a very basic workflow now, and I can see it working long term.
Okay, great.
But yeah, I do need to try doing it for, maybe a couple of months or so and see how it goes. But I'm feeling confident, and I think it should be, I think it's doable from a logistics point of view.
Yeah, I think for me, like the idea of tapping into a new audience is definitely an important thing. There are a lot of people who only consume content via YouTube. I'm pretty much one. I mean, I'm a rabid consumer of podcasts, but when I come home at the end of the day, I do consume most of my content on YouTube, and I'm watching documentaries and news and lots of different things. But I'm using YouTube as like the kind of main portal.
Yeah.
But I can remember, earlier. When it would have been, maybe a few months ago, the last time Ricky, Paprika Girl, was on the Just Japan podcast, and I posted on X that she was on the show, and someone I know who lives in Tokyo, who himself is a content creator, said, "Hey Kevin, like I only use YouTube to consume content." He was like, "Could you please put the podcast up on YouTube?" And I've heard that from other people too. They said even if I'm not watching it, I just use YouTube to listen to stuff. And now YouTube has that kind of podcast. It's not. I noticed feature. That it's more like a kind of a playlist type thing. But I mean, for me, it's just like there's an extra step there, and I'm like, oh gosh, I don't. It's hard enough for me just to get the podcast out, let alone then to produce a video of it. And actually, I'm also not in a setting where I have like a nice background. I mean, I recorded in my bedroom. I dream ideally maybe the next place I live, wherever that may be, I can have like my own room, and like with a podcasting room with like a shelf behind me where
is an issue.
Where I can put like toy. I have like a Japanese Tamika collection and different toys and and things, and I could decorate it and have it like some cool lights and a nice like backdrop.
I'd love that too. I'd love to do that. I mean, if you've seen my I've only got one video up. Of my podcast, and have you watched it by any chance? Or
I have, yeah. You had like the banner kind of behind you.
There's actually a big story behind that, which I'll talk about on a future episode. But that's an actual noren which I received while I was in Osaka, and so. Yeah, it was kind of like I played around with the idea of using that last year when I first started the channel. And I thought it's very busy. It's not ideal, to be honest, as a background for a talking head video production, but it has some kind of a sentimental value for me, and for now it kind of works, and it covers up my my room. But yeah, I totally get what you mean. I think there are ways around it though. Especially if you're a podcast and you're putting it on that podcast tab or that podcast playlist. I don't think people expect you to have much video. So you could actually get away with having a thumbnail of your logo.
Well, that's what I have put on my Busan Kevin YouTube channel. I mean, there are a lot of my back episodes are up there. Not all of them, but a lot of them are. And that's exactly what I did. I just, in Canva, I would just make like I'd make a static image using the logo and maybe some different pictures of whoever the content creator was, maybe, a photo of them and something. And I'd do that. And then I just, I'd make a video with the audio and that static image. It's another thing too, is I find that with this podcast, it being an interview style podcast, I definitely have had guests on in the past who are very reluctant to use video. They just will say, I don't feel comfortable being on video.
Yes.
Do we have to have video? A lot of people who are also unfamiliar with podcasting, they'll say, is this live? Or are people going to be watching us? And I'll have to explain, no, it's a Zoom call. It's just you and I. And you don't have to show yourself if you don't want to. So again, some people are very, no problem. Others,
of course, yes.
So I think, I don't know. It'd be interesting. I'm not really myself pursuing a video content in that way for all the things I've just mentioned. But I don't know, maybe that would be something if I did in the future, I'd have to kind of with the guests in advance when I'm trying to like kind of connect with them and kind of book them to say, hey, you're going to be on video if you don't mind.
Yeah. I mean, I've seen that there's a really interesting Japan podcast, or I don't know, they're not a podcast. They're on YouTube and they do interviews. It's called Unpacking Japan. I'm not sure if you've seen
that. They've had like basically kind of all of Japan Twitter has been on that one.
Yeah. So they do that kind of thing. They do like the whole video.
They have like
interview.
a studio. They have a studio.
Yeah,
they actually. I know. Casey from the Bean Pod.
That's right.
He was on it, and I know like Ricky's been on it, and like a whole bunch of people who've been on my podcast have been on Unpacking Japan. And they actually are. That podcast has the ability to bring the guests to Osaka. They bring them down and put them up in a hotel and stuff. And I know Casey shared his story in one of his episodes all about going down to Osaka and being brought around their company and shown things. And it's pretty cool to hear.
That's great. Yeah. Maybe I should get in touch with them.
Right.
But it's an interesting format though. But that's definitely like, I think that's a good example of a video version of an interview style podcast.
That is very cool. That is very cool. I think if I were to have more of a local kind of podcast, that would probably be the way to go. Like, back in the day when I was living in Kobe, I thought like when I started this podcast, initially, I mean, there wasn't a lot going on in the podcast. There was not really no podcast scene, so to speak, at that time in Japan. Not much, occasionally you'd have like maybe a new jet. Someone would be on the jet program and they'd start up a podcast and they'd be talking about their experiences. And that podcast would usually last 6 months and then disappear.
I see. Yes.
And I was always searching for podcasts. And again, I'd find them and it's like, and they were very fleeting. But I mean, I often thought of like, wouldn't it be cool to have like a Kobe based podcast where it was just about Kobe. I would interview business owners in Kobe, events in Kobe, things that were going on.
Yeah, that's awesome. I love that idea. Actually, I'm totally into that kind of concept.
And that way, you would have been able to. I would have been able to interview people in person. But
it's so much fun. Yeah,
but then I left.
You'll be back. Everyone comes back.
Oh yeah. I'm hoping to. But yeah, that's like a kind of. That would have been nice to get in the weeds of the city that I love so much and to try to showcase things. Maybe in the future. So, your podcast, I guess you are evolving. You now have a video format or video form. You've mentioned too that you now have some more time than you have in the past to maybe focus on your podcast. Where do you see the podcast going?
Wow, that's a good question. And I would be happy if it even got to halfway where I'm seeing it at, where my vision is. But I'd love it to become some kind of a useful resource for people, both living in Japan and people who are outside of Japan. Some kind of like not a news channel, but something where people can sort of get quality information about Japan. So I'm slowly just trying to find my way with that and develop it so that it becomes something that people can turn to when they want to get some quality content, but not something that's formal or not like a news channel. More like it's just a casual thing. Like you can tune in. You know that you're going to learn something when you tune in. And it's just easy to listen to. It's not too long. And that's it. And with YouTube, I'd love for it to become something where I can do more stuff than just podcasting.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Maybe branch out into kind of travel or different kind of aspects of culture, that kind of thing, or like documentary type things.
It could branch out into travel. It could branch out into like teaching Japanese, maybe. It could branch out into a lot of things. actually, at the beginning of this interview, you asked me what I do, and I actually haven't answered.
Okay,
I just
yeah.
realized I haven't answered what I do in Japan. So I'm a freelancer in Japan, and one of the things, the main things that I do is translation.
Okay.
I can't really talk about in detail what I translate, just due
Yeah,
to
sure. Yeah, yeah.
confidentiality and stuff like that. But I do translation, and I also do sort of bilingual project support
Okay.
for certain projects and things like that, where
Hmm.
there's a bit of interpreting, there's a bit of project management, there's a bit of bit of everything
Hmm.
in the industry. So there are things that I think I can share with people that people would be interested to learn about, where in regards to like careers in Japan and the working lifestyle in Japan and things like that. Setting up, being a freelancer, it's obviously I have my own business, so I think there are things that you can uh, talk about on YouTube that people would
Mm.
be interested in with things like that.
Mm.
But yeah, I think there's a lot of potential in terms of where this podcast can go. And I can see it branching out into different things in the future. It's something that I mentioned this on X a few weeks ago, I think, that I'm finally able to dedicate a regular sort of a schedule to this podcast or
That's
this
fantastic.
kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And that's something I worked quite hard to achieve, actually. Over the last year, I've kind of been really, snowed under with my work, and I
Yeah,
was
I mean,
like, you
like
know
when did
what?
I first reach out to you about being on the podcast? That was a long time ago, right? That
Yeah,
was
probably going back 6 months or
at
something.
least six
Yeah.
months or more. Yeah. And I was
Mm,
like, hey, why don't you come on the podcast? You're just like, I'm swamped, right? It's
yeah.
just like, and it was like,
It's
okay.
yeah.
Um,
Yeah, it was really crazy times, and
so
so yeah, I negotiated with my client and stuff, and I was like, you know what, um, for a while until further notice, my AMs they're booked, so I
okay.
can't. So I'm like, I've dedicated most of my, unless there's something urgent or something that really needs to get done.
Uh-huh.
I'm trying to dedicate all of my mornings to the podcast and
Okay.
any other creative things that might come up.
Oh, that's fantastic. That's so
Mm,
cool. Yeah, no, it's great when you have the time to do these things. I mean,
yeah,
I myself have just started a new little project, a new little podcasting project, the Tales from Kevin,
awesome.
and that was kind of a
Oh yeah, I heard a couple of those, or one of those episodes. I really loved it.
the
I
old
I
man
love
swimming.
that kind of real, yeah, the old man swimming. I love those kinds of real things, real stories, and unscripted, real. It's just
Well, that's
getting to know people.
it's been like something that people have been encouraging me to do. Like I'm very passionate about
Mm,
storytelling, and and it was I've had friends and I've had I don't know, shall I say fans, listeners, people
hmm.
like on
Yeah,
my Facebook and different places who've messaged me and saying, Kevin, yeah, it would be just great to hear you. I just want to hear stuff that you have to say, or I want to hear your
yeah.
stories or your views. And then the kind of the impetus behind really starting it was, 2 weeks ago when Kurt Bell made
Hmm.
a very heartfelt video. He said, kind of not a podcast, where he was like sitting outside in the desert drinking wine, and he was talking all about me and Ricky and Casey Bean and Joe
Yeah.
from Ishikawa 7 to See, and about all the things he likes about us. And he was like, and those three are so authentic, and they talk about themselves and stories. Kevin used to be like that when he was a YouTuber. And he was like,
Oh wow.
but he was like, but now it's Just Japan podcast is very interview based, kind of polished. It's very different. He was like, I would just love to hear Kevin telling stories, Kevin talking.
Mm,
And I thought, you know what? Let's do this, because in a day where we have Spotify for podcasters, I can set up a
yeah.
podcast for free. And one of the interesting things is I found is that, I mean, I've got a mind full of stories.
Mm,
I've got a notebook full of ideas for this podcast, and it's really interesting that the fact that it's just me alone doing it, I can do it
yeah.
whenever I want.
Mm,
I don't have
yeah.
to
That's
rely
that's
on
very, very
it.
that's free. That's
It's
very
very
free.
free, and that's why
Mm,
like
mm,
initially I'm planning on pumping out like 2 episodes a week for the first month or
mm.
so to try to hopefully kind of get a little bit of momentum.
Yeah.
Because I don't have to rely on arranging around someone else's schedule, connecting with
Yeah.
people. That's always a challenge, right? Because
It's a big challenge. This is actually
Exactly.
the first time out of 69 episodes. I've done 69 of my own podcast episodes, but this is the first time I'm being interviewed,
okay,
or doing an interview. So, yeah, my podcast is not really interview based at
yeah,
all. It's
exactly.
mostly, and that gives me the freedom to do what I want and present what I want in the way that I
Yeah.
want to, as well. But I do think having interviews every now and then is a fantastic idea because you can learn a lot through that dialogue, between
Yeah, well,
people.
that was the original like kind of intent of the Just Japan podcast was, I said to people, I started this back in like, it was like 2013 or 14, and I said to people,
Wow.
I my scope of Japan was very narrow. I was an international school teacher with two little kids in Japan. I basically get up in the morning and see and get on my bicycle and I'd ride off to work and then I would work all day and then I'd just come right home. And
Yeah.
I didn't have an exciting life of travel like like maybe a successful YouTuber would have or this or that. So, I kind of knew a lot about my little scope, but I wanted to hear from people who had the really different experiences. And
Yes.
that's why I decided to do the kind of interview format.
Mm.
And it's cool now. I hear there's a lot of shows out there that are doing similar things, which is really cool. And
Yeah. Yeah.
it's neat to hear. Once upon a time, I think when I was a newbie to Japan, I thought, oh, everyone here is either a translator or a teacher.
Mm.
And then you learn, wow, there's a lot of non-Japanese people
Yeah.
in Japan who are doing incredibly fascinating things.
Absolutely.
And
Yeah.
so many people that have incredibly fascinating stories about how they got there, what they do, how they ended up where they are. So
Yeah.
it's really inspirational for me often to talk to people, and learn these stories, right?
Yeah. It's really fantastic, and it's contributing to the whole community, I think, as well. Presenting stories like that, it's educating people. It's showing people different worlds, different dimensions.
Yeah.
It's a fantastic way to do that. Yeah, I agree. And I hope I can find ways to incorporate that into my own podcast as well sometime. Maybe have some interviews here and there. I'd love to do video kind of visits to places, maybe
That would
for
be
the
neat.
YouTube channel.
Yeah, that would
It
be
would be
very
cool.
cool. Yeah.
Yeah,
Awesome. So
lots of things.
I don't want to keep you too much longer. I mean, it's after 9 where you are, and I myself am
Yeah, no
suffering.
problem
I'm
at all.
suffering through a cold right now. I'm probably not sounding as Genki as I normally do for all of you guys out there listening. I'm kind of a little bit more sedate and just kind of going, And usually I have a lot more to add. But I'm barely hanging on. I'm barely hanging on. The whole family's been sick for a while.
No, no.
Yeah, that's what happens. It happens,
Well,
right?
yeah.
You get one gets it and it just rips through. There's nothing else you can do. But yeah, so where can people find you on the socials, on the social medias? Where can they find your podcast?
Well, you can find me if you Google Ohazassu podcast. That's OHAZASSU. If you just type in Ohazassu podcast in Google, all of my links come up. It's all on all of the major platforms. So Spotify, Google, Apple, Spreaker. There's a whole bunch. But if you go to my X account at Ohazassu podcast, you'll actually see a Linktree link in my profile. And Linktree is just a nice little service
Yeah.
where they let you put a whole bunch of links to all of
Yeah.
your things. So all of my links, including to my YouTube channel, they can all be found in my Linktree link that can be
Awesome.
found on my X channel. Yeah.
Well, I'll put that in the show notes as well. So everyone listening, there'll be links to the
Oh,
podcast
thank you very
and
much.
all that in the show
Appreciate
notes. And
it.
I'll share that on my social media too, like my Facebook page for the podcast, as well as like my Twitter. I don't like saying the
thanks
other
so
thing.
much.
I don't like
I
saying
appreciate it.
I don't like saying X.
It's real. I still can't. I'm not getting used to it. I really can't do
I
it.
can't do it. I can't do it. Especially because I just can't stand the man who's at the head of it all. Ugh.
Yeah, it's been a big mess ever since it changed.
Oh yeah,
Um,
yeah.
and
It has.
I can't get my head to say repost instead of retweet.
Right? I know. I know.
I keep seeing it come up in Japanese tweets. They instead of saying RT, they're saying RP,
Okay, yeah, yeah.
And I'm like, what? And when I first saw it, I was like, what the hell is an RP?
Yeah.
And it took me like half a day to figure out that it was repost.
Well, like that's it. And I've said this before on the podcast. Like, I think Ricky and I were talking about this. How like, for so many reasons, I would love to leave the platform, but there's such a great little community that I'm involved in, and there's so many neat people, and I've made such great real life friends from Twitter that I keep on hanging on. Because although other platforms are trying to kind of step up, it's still not the same. Like I'm on Blue Sky, no. I'm on Threads. There's like no engagement. Even I see, it's really different, right? So it's I still hang in there because again, I don't follow politics. I don't follow controversial things. I just follow happy things.
Likewise.
Japan things, some Malaysia things about insects. I like bugs. Things about nature. And
look, I think with any platform, the longer you use it, and the more you curate your feed and you figure out what you like and who you want to follow and who you don't want to follow, I think the experience actually improves. So I think for me, I think X has actually gotten better over the last year or so. Because I'm conscious of those things and who I interact with and how I interact with people.
Yeah.
But it's a two-edged sword, isn't it?
It is. But at the end of the day, we've got a great little community and we're building community.
Yeah.
So
I'm really looking forward to getting to know everyone a lot more and growing together. Yeah. It's really interesting and inspiring.
Kind of creating our little podcaster collective. On Twitter now. Yeah. And that's a cool thing because I think we can all maybe lift each other up and help each other out and help each other grow and get better and improve and be more creative.
I think so. Yeah, absolutely.
Fantastic. Okay. Well, John, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I really appreciate it. And
thank you for having me.
Yeah, let's do it again sometime in the future.
I look forward to it. Thanks very much, Kevin. I hope you have a good night and get well soon.
Again, I want to thank John for coming on the podcast to chat with me. Such an interesting topic. I love his podcast. I listen to it each week. It is a great one. And now he's got his video component, which makes it even better. Fantastic. And recently, myself and John and other Japan-based podcasters have been conversing a lot and talking to each other, helping each other get ideas to become more creative and just showing each other support, creating a little Japan podcasting collective, which is fantastic. So, John, again, thank you for coming on the podcast. All of you out there, go listen to the Ohazassu podcast. All the links are below in the show notes and on the Facebook page, of course, to go and follow his show. Go do it, follow it, subscribe, and all that stuff. One thing I mentioned at the very beginning of the podcast was that I have a new show called the Tales from Kevin podcast, a storytelling podcast, a podcast with just me. Initially, the first month, we've got 2 episodes a week coming out. By the time you listen to this, there's already 4 episodes out, and there's going to be 2 a week for the first month. So there's going to be a lot for you to listen to. The Tales from Kevin podcast, it's all over the place. It's on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, Amazon Music, all those, the usual suspects. So go check that out as well. That's it for this episode of the Just Japan podcast. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you are all doing very well. Of course, you can help the podcast grow by sharing it on your social media. And for my social media, you can find me on Twitter, X, at MadForMaple. I'm on Insta, at JlandKev, and there's a Facebook page too, the Just Japan Stuff Facebook page. Go check all the links below, of course, and go check out my new podcast, Tales from Kevin. I think you guys will enjoy it. If you like listening to me talk. All right, well, that does it, folks. Wherever you are in the world, I hope you're happy. I hope you're healthy, and I will be talking to you very soon.